The rain had been falling steadily over the small Yorkshire station, tapping against the glass roof like 1,000 hurried footsteps. Alice Turner pulled her coat tighter and checked her watch. It was nearly midnight, and the last train to London was about to depart. As always, she noticed him. The man with the grey overcoat, carrying a worn leather briefcase, stepping onto the platform with a calm air. He had been there every night she worked the late shift. Always the same routine: board the last carriage, sit by the window, and read a small green book until the train pulled away. Alice had never spoken to him, though she often wondered about his life. Who travelled every single night to London, in such weather, at such an hour? His face was pale, almost too pale, yet there was something dignified about his manner. Tonight, however, something unsettled her. When she scanned the passenger list on her clipboard, his name was not there. She frowned, certain she had seen him purchase a ticket. But when she glanced again at the platform, the man had already disappeared into the carriage. The whistle blew, and the train lurched forward. Alice walked along the platform, her eyes fixed on the lit windows of the last carriage. The man was there, seated by the window, turning a page of his book. But as the train vanished into the rain-soaked night, Alice felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The reflection in the window beside him seemed wrong. The man was seated, but his reflection did not move at all. The following evening, Alice returned to her post at the station, her thoughts still caught on the strange vision from the night before. The sound of the whistle, the rain on the roof, and that unmoving reflection haunted her mind. She opened the passenger list once more, running her finger down the neat column of names. Businessmen, students, travellers heading to London for family visits. But again, there was no sign of the man in the grey overcoat. When the train arrived, her heart tightened. And there he was, stepping out of the shadows onto the platform, just as calm as always. He adjusted his briefcase, nodded politely at no one in particular, and walked towards the last carriage. Alice hesitated. This time, she followed him. She stopped just short of the carriage door, peering in through the glass. He had already taken his seat, the small green book resting in his hands. "Excuse me, sir," Alice called as the train guard passed by. "That gentleman, did he purchase his ticket earlier?" The guard glanced into the carriage, then back at her. His brow furrowed. "Which gentleman, Miss Turner?" Alice pointed directly at the man by the window. Yet to her shock, the guard's eyes followed her hand to an empty seat. "There's no one there," he said firmly. "Are you feeling quite well?" Alice stared, frozen. Through her eyes, the man sat calmly, page turning between his fingers. But to everyone else, the seat was vacant. And then, for the briefest of moments, the man's head turned, and his eyes met hers through the window, eyes that seemed far older than his face, and filled with something she could not name. The rain had eased the next day, leaving the stone pavements of the Yorkshire station slick and glistening under the dim glow of the lamps. Alice Turner arrived earlier than usual, her steps echoing in the nearly empty hall. The station felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves remembered the man she had seen. She decided she needed proof, something beyond her own eyes. At the far end of the building stood the record room, a place where every ticket purchased and every passenger checked in was carefully logged. She unlocked the wooden door, its hinges groaning with reluctance, and stepped inside. The smell of old paper and ink greeted her, sharp and stale. Pulling the thick ledger towards her, she flipped through the recent pages. Each line bore the names of passengers who had boarded the late-night train to London. She recognized many: Mrs. Fairchild, who visited her daughter, young Robert Dawson returning to his studies, and a list of strangers bound for business. But never once did she see his name. Not Henry, not Thomas, not anything resembling the man she watched each night. Her hands trembled as she traced the empty spaces, convinced something had been erased. Suddenly, the door to the record room creaked open. Startled, Alice spun around. The guard from the night before stood there, his face uneasy. "You should not linger here alone," he said gruffly. His eyes shifted to the ledger on the desk. "That book will not give you what you're looking for." Alice swallowed, her voice low. "Then you saw him too, did you not? The man in the last carriage?" But the guard only shook his head slowly. "I have worked here 20 years, Miss Turner. And if you truly saw someone in that seat, then you saw what none of us dare to speak of." Alice's breath caught. "What do you mean?" The guard hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "The man who never arrived." Before she could press him further, a noise carried down the corridor, footsteps, steady and deliberate. Both of them turned towards the sound. The hallway was empty, yet the echo of those unseen steps grew louder, as though someone was walking straight towards them. The footsteps in the corridor faded as suddenly as they had begun, leaving only silence. The guard muttered something under his breath and quickly excused himself, his boots echoing down the hall until Alice was left alone in the record room. The silence pressed heavily against her chest, until even the ticking of the clock on the wall felt unnaturally loud. She closed the ledger and decided to search further. At the back of the record room stood a tall cabinet filled with forgotten documents and photographs of the station from years long gone. Dust clung to the frames, their glass fogged with time. Alice drew one out carefully, wiping the surface with her sleeve. The photograph showed a group of railway staff, smiling stiffly at the camera. Their uniforms were dated, their faces unfamiliar, except one. Her breath hitched. There, standing at the far left, was the man in the grey overcoat, unmistakable with his pale face and the same worn briefcase at his side. The picture had been taken decades earlier. Yet he looked exactly as he did now. Not a wrinkle different. Not a hair out of place. Alice staggered back, the photograph trembling in her hands. She glanced again at the date neatly printed beneath it, 1923. 100 years ago. Her mind reeled. The man she had seen boarding the last carriage night after night had been dead for a century. But why had no one spoken of him? Why had the guard reacted with such unease? Alice slipped the photograph into her coat, hiding it close to her heart. She knew she had to confront the truth, even if it meant breaking the silence that hung over the station like a curse. That night, when the last train pulled in, she stood on the platform waiting. Rain misted against her face, cold and fine. The doors opened with a hiss, and once again, he stepped down from the shadows. The grey overcoat. The briefcase. The same slow, deliberate steps. This time, Alice gathered her courage and called out. "Sir. Please. Who are you?" The man stopped. Slowly, his head turned. His eyes locked onto hers, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. He raised a hand to his hat as though in polite greeting. And then, in a voice that carried over the sound of the rain, he answered with only 2 words. "Not yet." The words echoed in Alice's mind long after the figure vanished into the moving train. Not yet. They felt like a warning, or perhaps a promise. She barely slept that night, her dreams filled with the pale face and the stillness of his reflection in the glass. The following evening she returned, determined to step further than before. When the last train arrived, she waited at the door of the final carriage. The man appeared as always, slipping inside without looking at her. This time, before fear could root her in place, Alice followed. The interior of the carriage smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, though it was newly cleaned only hours earlier. The seats were nearly empty, a few passengers scattered along the rows. Yet none of them seemed to notice the man in the grey coat. He had taken his usual place by the window, the green book resting on his lap. Alice slid into the seat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. The train jolted forward, wheels clattering against the tracks, carrying them into the darkness beyond the station. She cleared her throat. "Why are you here? Why every night?" The man slowly lifted his head. His eyes held the same calm weight, but closer now, Alice saw the shadows beneath them, deep as if carved by sorrow. He did not answer at once. Instead, his lips moved in a whisper so faint that she had to lean forward to hear. "They never let me off," he said. Alice froze. "What do you mean?" His gaze shifted back to the window. In the reflection of the glass, his figure shimmered strangely, like smoke disturbed by a breath. "I board. I travel. But I never arrive. Not anymore." Her skin prickled, a shiver running down her spine. She glanced around, but the other passengers read their papers or stared into the night, utterly unaware. It was as though she alone existed in this strange conversation. Alice leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who stopped you from arriving?" At that, his eyes snapped back to hers, and the faint smile returned. "You should not ask." "Not yet." Suddenly, the train plunged into a tunnel, the carriage swallowed by darkness. In that instant, the whisper that left his lips was not his own voice, it was a chorus of many voices layered together, sorrowful and pleading. And they all spoke her name. The next morning, Alice could not shake the voices from her mind. They had spoken her name with such desperate urgency, as though they had been waiting for her all along. She reported for her shift at the station, but every sound, the whistle of an early train, the slam of a carriage door, seemed to echo unnaturally, drawing her back to the events of the night before. That afternoon, she sought out the oldest man in the building, Mr. Graham, the station master. He had served the railway for nearly 50 years, his hair silver, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. Alice found him in his office, poring over timetables. The air smelled of tobacco and old paper. "Mr. Graham," she began hesitantly, "do you know anything about the last carriage on the midnight train?" His eyes flickered up to hers, and for a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, very slowly, he put down his pen. "Why do you ask, Miss Turner?" Alice hesitated, then produced the photograph she had taken from the archive. She slid it across his desk. The station master's hand froze halfway to the paper. "I saw him," Alice whispered. "He is still here." Mr. Graham's jaw tightened. With a sigh, he leaned back in his chair. "You should not meddle with things you do not understand," he said, though his voice trembled. "That man was Charles Redfern. He died in the crash of 1923, along with dozens of others. The midnight train never reached London. It derailed just outside the city. The wreck was terrible. Bodies burned, names lost." Alice's stomach dropped. "But why does he still board the train? Why do I see him?" The station master's eyes darkened. "Because not all of them left. Some say the souls of those who never made it still travel the line. They wait for something, or someone, to release them. But no one dares speak of it. The company buried the accident, for fear of scandal. They silenced the survivors. And those who see the passengers, they never remain the same." Alice gripped the arms of her chair. Her heart pounded at his words. Release them. The whispers last night had not been madness. They had been calling her, pleading with her. Mr. Graham leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If he has spoken to you, then he has chosen you. I pray you do not learn why." At that moment, the clock struck midnight in the hallway outside. The sound was deafening, 12 heavy chimes rolling through the air. Alice looked at the station master in horror. Her shift had ended hours ago, yet somehow, the hour had passed in a blur. And she realized with dread that she could already hear it, the whistle of the last train, arriving far too soon. Alice spent the next morning in the station's archive room, a dusty corner of the building few people ever visited. Old timetables, staff ledgers, and stacks of faded tickets filled the cabinets, some dating back almost a century. Her supervisor had granted her permission to tidy the place, but in truth Alice was searching for something far more specific. She wanted proof, any trace, that the passenger she had been seeing had once existed in the records of the railway. Her fingers brushed across the brittle paper of a ledger from the 1990s. Columns of names, ticket numbers, and destinations ran in neat, cramped handwriting. She was about to close the book when her eyes froze on a familiar word, Drake. Samuel Drake. The name leapt from the page like a whisper from the grave. He had travelled regularly from that very station to London, always on the late train. The final entry against his name, however, was marked with a red line. The date beside it matched the day of the tragic derailment 15 years earlier. Alice's chest tightened. There was no doubt, this was the same man. Yet what unsettled her more was a note scribbled at the edge of the page. It read, "Body never recovered." Her hand trembled as she traced the words. She remembered the dark-eyed passenger, so solid and ordinary in his grey coat, folding his paper as though he belonged to the present moment. But if his body had never been found, what exactly was she seeing every night? She closed the ledger and tucked it back onto the shelf just as the door creaked open. Richard Moore, the senior ticket inspector, stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing in here, Alice?" he asked, his voice low and suspicious. "This room isn't for idle curiosity." Alice stammered something about clearing dust, but Richard's eyes narrowed as though he knew she was lying. He stepped closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and lowered his voice. "Some histories are better left untouched. Mark my words, girl. Don't go digging where you've no business." She nodded quickly, but inside her resolve only grew stronger. That night, when the last train rolled into the platform, Alice positioned herself where she could see every passenger. And sure enough, there he was again, Samuel Drake, sitting calmly by the window, gazing into the rain. Alice's pulse raced. The ledger had told her he had never arrived. Richard had warned her to leave it alone. But now, staring at the man who should not exist, she realized there was no turning back. She had to know why he kept coming, and what secret bound him to the midnight train. Alice sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers she had managed to gather from the old station records. Most of them were mundane, maintenance schedules, rosters, and ticket logs, but hidden amongst them was a single folder marked with a date. The same date as the tragic accident from years ago. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the thin sheets of paper inside carrying the weight of a truth long buried. The report described a collision that had occurred late at night on the Yorkshire line, when a faulty signal had directed two trains onto the same track. Several passengers had died instantly, while others had been injured. Yet what caught Alice's eye was a scribbled note attached at the end of the file. It was unsigned, written in hurried strokes, but it stated one chilling line. "They told us to bury the list of survivors." Alice felt the air grow thin around her. Survivors. That detail had never been mentioned in the public reports. The newspapers had claimed all were either deceased or identified swiftly. If someone had survived and their name was erased, then why? And how did it link to the man she kept seeing on the midnight train? She read on, her pulse quickening. The note suggested that one passenger, a man traveling alone, had been removed from the official records. No explanation was given, but the implication was clear: someone powerful had wanted his presence erased from history. Alice whispered aloud, as if speaking the truth would anchor her in reality. "He should not exist, but he does." Her mind reeled back to every encounter she had with the mysterious passenger. His steady gaze, his calm presence, his silence. Perhaps he was one of the survivors, or perhaps something far stranger, caught between the living and the dead, a man denied acknowledgement, forced to ride the same train again and again. Just as she closed the folder, a sharp knock echoed through her flat. Alice froze. It was late, far too late for visitors. She rose cautiously and approached the door, her breath shallow. Another knock followed, louder this time, urgent. "Alice Turner." A man's voice called, deep and commanding. She pressed her palm to the door but did not answer. Something told her that whoever stood on the other side already knew far too much about what she had just discovered. And then, through the thin wood of the door, came a whisper that chilled her to the bone. "You have seen him too." The storm had finally begun to ease, though the night remained cloaked in a heavy mist that clung to the platform like a shroud. Alice stood at the edge of the tracks, her hands trembling as she clutched the small leather journal she had found inside the hidden compartment of the station office. The entries were written in Samuel's hand, each one describing journeys he had taken on the midnight train long before his death. But the final pages spoke of something far darker. They told of a pact made on the eve of his fatal accident, a vow that his spirit would not rest until the truth of what had been concealed by the railway company was revealed. The sound of the train grew louder, the familiar screech of metal on metal echoing into the night. Alice turned, her heart racing, as the last train emerged from the mist. Its headlights cut through the gloom, and there, just as always, sat Samuel in his corner seat. But this time, he was not alone. Rows of silent passengers filled the carriages, their faces pale and vacant, their eyes fixed upon Alice as though waiting for her to make a choice. She stepped forward, drawn by a force she could neither resist nor explain. The doors slid open with a hiss, and for the first time, Samuel rose from his seat. His voice carried across the platform, steady and solemn. "This is the truth they buried, Alice. You have seen what others refuse to see. Will you carry it forward, or let us remain bound to these rails for eternity?" The mist swirled around her as she stood on the threshold, the weight of the journal heavy in her hands. Behind Samuel, the passengers leaned closer, their expressions pleading. Alice took a deep breath. The train shuddered, as though impatient for her answer. The platform beneath her feet seemed to vanish into the fog, and with one step she crossed the threshold into the carriage. The doors closed. The midnight train pulled away, its whistle piercing the silence of the sleeping town. As the sound faded into the night, the station stood empty once more, its secrets finally carried away on a journey without return.